The Travis Walton abduction story is the most famous UFO case in human history. The narrative, as well as the series of events that happened after the incident itself, create a very compelling case that this UFO encounter really happened. There's good reason to believe that this story was real. I even believed this story for a while. It's so clean and streamlined, and all of the people involved in the encounter were tested with polygraphs, and 6 of the 7 people were found to be telling the truth. On the 5th of November, 1975, just before 5 p.m., a group of loggers allegedly encountered a UFO in the woods while driving home, and after stopping to check it out, one member of the group, Travis Walton, was supposedly attacked and abducted by the strange craft. The rest of the group fled the scene to save their lives, rushing to town to tell the police. Travis would reappear in town 5.5 days later, dehydrated and disoriented, remembering only a brief few moments of his time on the flying saucer. Travis would go on to publish a book about it a few years later called The Walton Experience. This story was huge. It gained a lot of attention in the media. They even created a film based on the story back in 1993 called Fire in the Sky, which was genuinely a really good movie. It scared me as a kid. This case is special because of the details of the encounter. The memories Travis has of being in an alien craft, seeing space, interacting with non-human beings. And on top of that, he's got 6 co-workers in the truck watching this all happen, corroborating his story. 5 of the 6 of them passing their polygraphs. This story is really compelling when it's told faithfully in a documentary format. But I started thinking about this case again recently, and I couldn't help but feel skepticism when listening to Travis himself recall the series of events. It made me uneasy. And the more I looked into it, the more sketchy information I started to find, and the less trustworthy I felt that Travis could be. You're gonna find a ton of websites and articles that absolutely love this encounter, but if you scratch beyond the surface of the average UFO enthusiast's description of these events, it paints a slightly different picture of the events that night, and a slightly different picture of the kind of man that Travis Walton might be. I've heard this story quite a few times. Chances are you've heard about the Travis Walton abduction once or twice yourself. And as fascinating and compelling as the mainline story is, there were things that were said and things that happened that the average UFO enthusiast tends to omit from their version of the events. I get it, everybody wants to believe in aliens, everybody wants to believe in UFOs, but it would be a lot easier for me to be a UFO enthusiast if there was a lot more honesty in the community. We know there are liars in every single one of these paranormal communities. People who have made a career out of spinning up fake stories about personal encounters, fabricating evidence, or even hoaxing things for the public to see. But sometimes we fail to see a liar because we struggle to believe that somebody would be willing to tell such a bold lie, or that they'd be willing to be so deceptive or evil. Travis Walton is one of those bold liars. When looking at all the details of the Travis Walton case, especially the series of polygraph tests that he and his friends mostly passed, it's hard to call these men liars. How can 7 people make up a UFO abduction story and only one of them gets inconclusive results on their polygraph? That's wild. The story is tight, it all wraps up in a neat little bow. The investigators and the prosecutors all seemed convinced that all parties were telling the truth, more or less. And the media is happy to present this entire event as fact. So trust me, I understand why people are swayed by testimonies like this. For me, while I'm going over this story again, I can't help but feel that Travis Walton is a liar, the entire event was hoaxed intentionally, and likely several people were in on the lie from the very beginning. So, do aliens exist? Do they visit our planet and interact with humans? Was Travis Walton abducted by aliens on the 5th of November, 1975, near Snowflake, Arizona? On the 5th of November, 1975, near Snowflake, Arizona, Travis Walton, along with the rest of his 7-man logging crew, had just piled into their pickup truck at the end of a hard day's work. With his buddy Mike at the wheel, they were driving down a dirt road trying to make it back into town when the group spotted a glow from the woods that they thought might be some kind of fire. At first, the group wasn't too worried about it, but as they got closer and found themselves next to a clearing, they could see some sort of a glowing object hovering above the ground a few meters away from the road. Everyone was mesmerized by what they saw. Mike pulled the truck over to check it out. Travis wanted to see the object up close, so he jumped out of the truck to get a better look. He described the craft as being perfectly smooth, shiny, and metallic, much like the saucer described by Bob Lazar in Area 51. Everyone else was too scared to approach the object, so they stayed in the truck, begging Travis to get back into the vehicle so that they could leave. The glowing craft quickly moved and seemed to notice Travis, so he hid behind a rock. But when he tried to escape, the saucer struck him with a beam of light, instantly incapacitating him. The rest of the crew assumed that they had just witnessed the UFO killing their buddy Travis, and fearing for their own lives, they abandoned him, driving off to tell the police what had happened. A police search party was immediately assembled, and with a couple members of Travis's party joining in, they returned to the last location that they saw him alive, near the clearing where he had interacted with the flying saucer. The Navajo County Sheriff put the word out. Travis Walton was now officially a missing person. And because the other 6 members of his logging crew were the last people to see him alive, they were immediately put up for suspicion for killing Travis and hiding his body in the woods. Of course, the police were reluctant to believe the UFO story at first. And like I said, the crew underwent a polygraph test, and 5 of the 6 were found to be telling the truth, with only one of them being found inconclusive. The polygraph examiner said that if someone had faked this UFO encounter, that these boys weren't part of the hoax. Even the deputy that took their initial statement said that if these boys are just acting, then they're really good at it. The police seemed convinced that the logging crew believed every word that they were saying. And to me, this is the craziest part of the story. How did this logging crew come across as so convincing? The police managed to come up with nothing. So a day later, the search party was called off. But around 5.5 days after he was reported missing, Travis Walton was spotted at a gas station outside of town, skinny, dehydrated, and with a bit of extra facial hair. And it says here that Travis was, buck-ass naked. Travis would use the phone booth to make a call to have his family come rescue him. According to Travis, he was abducted by non-human beings who took him onto their craft so that they could heal him from a mortal wound that apparently they themselves accidentally inflicted on him during their interaction in the woods. Travis did not pass the polygraph test. The polygraph examiner said that Travis kept playing with his leg and performing other actions that suggested that he was trying to trick the polygraph machine. So Travis had been practicing how to lie to a lie detector. Okay, cool. However, he would later pass another test, which was enough to get the law off of everyone's backs, and everyone was let go. Travis would later recall a brief few minutes when he was conscious during his time on the flying saucer. At some point, Travis remembers slowly waking up on a table. At first, he thought he saw a doctor leaning over him, but as he regained his vision, he realized he was surrounded by 3 little gray men in red suits. Less than 5 foot tall, with giant eyes and a large domed head. Travis panicked, but managed to easily push one of them back, finding the entity to be very light and soft. He apparently jumped off the table and threatened to fight the rest of them with a small tube that he found in the room. Apparently, this was enough to scare them off, and the little gray men left the room. Travis took this opportunity to explore and found himself in a room that had a large display of space on the screen. Travis said that there was a chair in the center of the room with a joystick, and when he played with that joystick, it would change the display on the screen. While he was playing with the display, Travis turned around to find someone standing in the doorway behind him. This being looked like a human wearing a tight blue spacesuit with a glass dome over his head. The blue human didn't seem to understand a word Travis said, but appeared very pleasant. The blue man then took Travis by the arm and led him out of the craft. At this point, Travis thought he was being rescued. They walked down a ramp into some kind of a hangar bay where Travis would see two other saucers docked in the bay along with the craft that he had just exited. He was led into a room off of the hangar bay where there were two more people, a man and a woman, that Travis described as also being very human looking, with lighter hair and golden hazel eyes. The three blue people then put Travis on a table and placed a mask over his face. Travis said that he fought back but was overpowered, and then he blacked out. And that was the last thing Travis remembered happening before he woke up next to the road and walked back into town.
When I first regained consciousness, I was laying on the roadway, well, to the side of the road, more off than on. And my head was on my arm, and I saw a light, and I looked up in time to see it go off, which I think was either a light going off or a hatch closing, perhaps.
Travis apparently had no sense of how much time had passed, thinking it had only been a few hours since his abduction. Shocked to find out that he had been a missing person for 5 days. The Travis Walton incident is the most famous UFO abduction story of all time, celebrated as a golden testimonial in the UFO community. A few years later, Travis would publish his first book about the incident, The Travis Walton Experience, and a few years after the film was released, he published another book with the same name as the film, Fire in the Sky, which may or may not be the same as the first book. I don't know, I'm too lazy to check. Travis had done countless interviews, radio and television appearances. He goes to a lot of conventions still. He's done group tours of the abduction site. He's made his own investigative videos proving something happened in the woods in the 70s. He's even done some podcasts recently. It's been almost 50 years since the incident in the woods, and Travis Walton has maintained every word of his story to this day. So, why do I think he's full of shit? I've ranted about aliens a million times before. I don't think that aliens are necessary to explain anything that happened in our history. I don't think that aliens are the ones pulling off all these crazy tricks around the world, like cattle mutilations and crop circles. The fact is that the Travis Walton encounter was the case that kept me believing in aliens the longest. So I think that that's probably why I'm so offended by it, because I feel like an idiot that I ever believed it. But this isn't about hating aliens. I don't hate aliens. I love UFOs and close encounter stories. I had a podcast where I would read people's close encounter experiences. Back in the early days of this story, most of the interviews that Travis did were audio only, meant to be heard on radio shows and the like. It would have been rare back then for someone like that to get a lot of screen time on television. Travis appeared on a few shows. I mean, Leonard Nimoy said that he thought he was being truthful, but he was usually set up as a quick novelty before the show would move on to some other nonsense like a psychic or something. When listening to these old radio spots, the soft tone of some of these interviews, the intimate music, it's very disarming. Travis comes off as very reasonable, and it gives you a false sense of sincerity.
And so when he motioned for me, and he took me by the arm, I went with him. I assumed I was being rescued.
Travis was led out of the craft and into a large hangar where more human-like figures were present.
I am so glad that Travis Walton still appears on podcasts and goes to conventions today, because it's really the modern media that makes it more obvious. I mean, he's getting to be an older guy, and the alien abduction shtick doesn't translate as well into modern media. He's also become very comfortable telling his story. He can just very easily get into character and matter-of-factly recall the series of events without ever adding or subtracting any details. I find Travis far too rigid with his story. I mean, the guy loves talking about himself and doing interviews, but in none of those interviews can anybody get him to deviate from those same key talking points. Dude's been telling the exact same story since 1975. Even a newspaper said the same thing. For someone abducted by aliens, Travis doesn't have a lot to say. I've noticed that Travis very rarely ever looks at the interviewer in the eyes when he's describing his story. He even locks his face into this weird left glance the entire time. But we know already that Travis Walton was a practiced deceiver. As I said, he was caught trying to trick the polygraph machine by fidgeting with his leg. So by locking his glance to the left, this may be his way of avoiding letting his eyes dart around while he recalls the series of events, so he doesn't appear like he's lying live on camera. And when Travis does have something to add, it's a brand new story that's completely unrelated with the original abduction in 1975. And it always seems like he's just adding the story because he wants to make himself appear more special. His ego shines through a lot more in these modern interviews. Travis has never done an interview with a skeptic or a critic, but he always seems to be vividly aware of the skepticism and the criticism that he has received for peddling his brand. During interviews, he regularly injects qualifiers to deflect skepticism from his claims. He'll just randomly get defensive and attack skeptics, even when he has complete control of the interview. The reason this is a Tell Me More episode is because I don't really have an answer for this one, other than he obviously wasn't abducted by aliens. But I can't find the obvious angle to lie. So the question becomes, what kind of lie is this? And why is he lying? Were all of his coworkers in on the lie with him, or just that one that failed the polygraph test? And how did so many of the boys pass the polygraph test in the first place? Did Travis really hoax all of them too? Was this hoax concocted and executed by Travis himself? Or did he have co-conspirators? Or was this part of some greater cover-up? Did Travis fail his initial polygraph test because he was tired, like he says? Or did Travis fail his initial polygraph test because he was trying to trick the polygraph machine by fidgeting and playing with his leg, like the polygraph examiner says? Is Travis lying for fame and for ego? Or was Travis's desire for fame and ego exploited by some government agency in order to turn him into the face of some form of alien propaganda? Why were the police so willing to believe everyone's story about an alien abduction and conclude their investigation without laying any charges? Did something really happen in the woods outside of Snowflake, Arizona on the 5th of November, 1975? One of the things that made me want to believe Travis for so long was the unlikelihood that a character such as a blue-collared lumberjack would spin up an elaborate story like this just to become world famous and get on television. I mean, hell, the guy's still doing interviews and going to conventions today. A normal guy doesn't want to do that. That displays passion. It displays purpose. I didn't understand when I was younger that he was being platformed on specific programs that were willing to frame his story in such a way that the audience would inherently trust that the story was true. It would convey a false sense of sincerity. Eventually, it got to the point where Travis had simply done too many interviews, and the robotic, unchanging delivery of his story had repeated too many times, and the cracks were starting to show. Travis very clearly wants to remain relevant. He wants to be seen as important. His more recent interviews have revealed some other insecurities. He kind of reminds me of some other UFO guys that I've talked about before, like Stephen Greer, who like to make everything about themselves. The most frustrating aspect of Travis's persona is that he isn't some simple everyman lumberjack that ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time with a chance encounter with a UFO and aliens that changed his perspective of the universe. Before he was abducted, Travis was already an avid UFO enthusiast.
What happened prior to this? Were you a believer in UFOs? Did you have any experiences prior? What was your first impression before the event
I had
of your
actually
time?
had some sightings before. It's not unusual up in this country because, you live in the out of doors, and it's an area where the skies are clear much of the time.
It would be rare enough for someone to see a single UFO in their lifetime, let alone get abducted by aliens. But Travis seems to be one of those magical special beings that sees UFOs all the time. He won't stop spinning up stories about them.
Went to a MUFON meeting. It was held at Burbank, California. After it was over, we were headed home. And we saw this light in the distance. It was just coming towards us. Then it was apparent that it was moving extremely fast. When you're watching an airport, a jet airliner come into the airport, they seem like they're barely moving. But if they weren't doing a couple of 100 miles an hour, they'd fall out of the sky. This thing just came so fast, stopped right over the top of us, a light on each corner of this giant triangle, and I mean gigantic. It was unbelievably huge. Did a 90 degrees, pointed towards the west, towards the Pacific, and shot off. How could something that big move that fast?
Come on, man. He acts like he's chosen or something. This isn't realistic. He simply experienced far too many UFO encounters in his life. It's been too many, since and before his abduction in 1975. This changes the entire image of his character, in my opinion. It would have been so much better, it would have been so much more believable if he had pretended that he spent most of his life as a skeptic and never really thought much about aliens or UFOs, until that fateful night where he was confronted with them and forced to accept them into his reality. Now that's a story. A normie blue-collar guy working 9 to 5, confronted with a larger universe. Strangely, Travis's mother was reluctant to help and lethargic during the police search. There were dozens of people there with her in the woods looking for her son. They all think that he's dead, and she wanted to give up early and go home, saying that looking for Travis was useless, because he's very likely not on this world. So yeah, that's a bit bizarre. Even more bizarre were his brothers, though. Travis's older brother was angry about it, furiously digging through debris in the woods trying to find Travis's body. But his other brother seemed to trust the loggers and believe the UFO story for some reason. Travis's younger brother would go on to say that he wasn't very worried about Travis because UFOs always bring their victims back to their abduction site. Why would he just trust that? It's just strange that two of Travis's closest family members were so cavalier and trusting about the entire ordeal. It's funny. This story also shares a lot of similarities with another abduction story told by Betty and Barney Hill in 1961. People have accused Travis of stealing details from their story to bolster his. And I tend to agree. For example, Travis tends to be a little cheeky when he's describing the aliens that he saw. When he's in interviews, even today, he'll say that they're typical for today. The reason he says that is because even though he is right that the average person at the time had no shared concept of what an alien looked like, Betty and Barney Hill had described almost the exact same thing as Travis, right down to the colored uniforms. Again, this was back in 1961. Betty and Barney Hill also had a star chart room in their story, which actually played a significant role in their narrative, unlike Travis Walton's story. The aliens supposedly used that star chart to teach Betty and Barney Hill where they come from. It's very likely Travis described the same aliens to immediately evoke the same imagery and make his story seem more credible. This is something hoaxers often do. They copy details from the public zeitgeist in an attempt to become a hero or a memorable character to the UFO community's ongoing story. And the reason why the UFO community would be so receptive to characters like this is because these sorts of stories validate all the research that they've been doing, and it confirms their belief system. So if the public believes this guy, then it makes the entire UFO community seem more credible. So everybody kind of helps perpetuate the lie that way. The entire paranormal community is fueled by ego and confirmation bias. And just like Betty and Barney Hill, there were a good deal of books published about the incident, earning Travis Walton some royalties over the years. One of Travis's books came out a few years after the film based on his story, and he gave his book the exact same title to ape off of the clout of the movie. He was always happy to make money off of his experience and exploit the media hype around it. Throughout time, there are these different periods when aliens are trending in the media, both in news reports and in fiction. Most of the UFO encounters I've talked about so far on this channel date back to the 1960s, the heat of the Cold War. The Travis Walton abduction happened right before and around the same time as the release of films like Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So aliens were trending. People were dreaming about aliens back then. But basically it led into the Spielbergian era of films, we'll say. Like I said, Fire in the Sky was released in 1993. That was the exact same year that X-Files premiered on Fox, along with films like the Body Snatchers remake and Coneheads, for whatever that's worth. This was the leading edge of the 90s alien film craze, which got us movies like Independence Day, Men in Black, Mars Attacks, Space Jam. God, I loved those movies when I was a kid. As for Fire in the Sky, the reason I think they would have greenlit a film about the Travis Walton abduction at the leading edge of that is because it was a recognizable story that was already really popular in the zeitgeist. So it probably would have done well. It did do pretty well in theaters. Anyways, back to the abduction. One of the main reasons the police were struggling to trust the story that these boys were peddling back in 1975 is because members of the logging crew had already complained about the conditions that they had agreed upon on that patch of land, and it seemed like they wanted out of their logging contract. I can't remember the exact agreement, but the crew was making like $1 a tree or something ridiculous like that. And if that's true, then the day that they encountered the UFO would have been a really good day to be angry about that, because they weren't even cutting down trees that day. They were clearing up brush and collecting it for the Forest Service to be burned for fire prevention. I bet they were all stewing about it that day, wishing that they could just go back to cutting trees to make their living. At the end of the day, the only things going for Travis are, first, that most of his buddies with him in the truck that night didn't fail their polygraph tests, am I right? As long as that isn't just some blatant lie that we're told in the media about this story, then that suggests that some of the guys in that truck that night really did see something bizarre, and they really did see something happen to Travis. And whatever it was, it scared them. According to the police, at least. Can we trust the police here? Or did the feds coerce them? Is there some greater game being played here? And if these guys really were just doing this to get out of their logging contract, then they made a really good show of it. Was the logging contract really that bad that they all had to run into town screaming, pretending that their friend got abducted? But the second major piece of evidence in Travis Walton's favor is that there appears to be some kind of a bizarre condition left behind on some of the tree stumps where he allegedly encountered the UFO in 1975. It appears that for some time, the trees in that area were growing slightly faster for several years before returning back to their regular growth speed.
Now this tree was probably just a tiny little sapling at the time, but the accelerated growth part you can see here is still solid. After the tree died, the part that was not affected by accelerated growth, where the rings return to a more normal thickness, it rots and this other part doesn't.
Travis suggests that this was an effect left behind by the flying saucer that abducted him.
This tree here was a logging-sized tree, and there's been no logging on this contract since 1974. So this tree we know was cut the year prior to the incident. So we have here these tree rings going back probably 150 years that show minimal variability in the growth rate here on this ridge. The effect on accelerated growth seems to have been limited, like it went on for 15 or 20 years and then faded away. This tree was actually growing and was about this big around at the time the incident happened. Then it had this period of extremely rapid growth, and you can see that those rings resist decay. And then after the effect slowed down and growth rate returned to normal, you've got growth rings of a similar thickness here and here, the susceptibility to rot returned. But during that time of accelerated growth, you have resistance to rot.
So there's a chance that some kind of radiation was left behind at the scene. Maybe something did happen on the 5th of November 1975. Maybe the alien story is just some spin to cover up what those boys saw that night. Did they see something top secret that they weren't supposed to see? But I don't know. Tell me what you guys think. Was Travis Walton a hoaxer that fabricated the entire story with his buddies, hoping to get famous off of the UFO craze by stealing details off of Betty and Barney Hill's abduction story? Was Travis Walton actually abducted for 5 days, operated on by non-human entities, and then dumped back in the woods? Did Travis Walton accidentally stumble across something radioactive in the woods that night? Something top secret that he wasn't supposed to see, and the entire story is cover-up spin to hide the actual series of events that night? Were the police in on it, or did the police genuinely believe the testimonies given to them by Travis Walton's co-workers? They said the dude got abducted by aliens. Let me know in the comments section below. I personally don't believe this story, but I thought that it deserved a video because it's a good example of a UFO story that I used to believe, only because I didn't look closely enough at the details and I just trusted the way that the media presented it to me.